So this is a talk about the Coquitlam Sockeye restoration. And I call it a journey because there's no clear path. There's no clear answer, or in fact, we're going to end up in the future. And this is really a form of throwing ideas out for others to talk about with their experiences and try to plot a path or various paths that hopefully will lead us to a place that in 3 or 4 or 5 generations, that's 15 to 20 years from now, there will be a vibrant sockeye salmon spawning return to the Coquitlam River watershed. So I thought I'd start with this picture of our old friend Gord, who was the assessor for many years on the Coquitlam River, looking at the very first sockeye salmon coming back to the river. And this one died. It died below the dam. It was near the dam. It didn't enter the trap, but it was unsuccessful. It didn't fulfill its migratory urge to get into the lake. And this is going to be the challenge as we look at various options, whether it's to re-anandromize kokanee that exists now in the Coquitlam Reservoir, or create new runs of anandromous fish that come up quite early and spawn early in the upper tributaries, or potentially runs that will come in later in the year and spawn in the lower tributaries of Coquitlam Reservoir. Anytime these fish are taken into fish culture, the new hatchery environment, we have to understand the challenges of keeping that fish alive from the time we captured them to the time they spawn. So for the fish returning to the reservoir, they may return July and August and have to be held October and November in a safe environment. Very different than the environment that they spend the summer in naturally. That's deep in the bottom of Coquitlam Reservoir, where it's dark, no velocity, no stimulus, stable temperature, probably pretty good oxygens, and we're putting it in a much more dynamic environment in the hatchery, or even just dealing with them in other places that we may hold them. It is an unknown. Can we do it? Can we keep the fish alive long enough to spawn? So I had previously suggested that we make a partnership with the Alouette Sockeye Salmon Restoration Team and see if they would be willing to allow the Coquitlam team to hold returning adults to the Alouette Dam, hold them, and see if they could get them to maturity, do an egg take, rear them as fry, right up to smolts, and then return them marked back to the Alouette. And what that's about is, I recall in the very first year that salmon returned to the Alouette, we had not a full agreement to move them into the lake yet. We had to hold them. And as I recall, we had a dozen or more fish, and we released only a handful. And what it was because we had mortalities holding them. And again, this is the unknown part of this journey. We have to learn what is our success rate to holding fish, especially the ones that spawn later in the year but migrate earlier, like the native populations in both Alouette and Coquitlam. So the sooner we start on that journey, the better, and that's why I thought Alouette could give the Coquitlam a few years head start. We could test our ability to do the program and produce viable smolts at the end of it. And then the second part of that story, if those smolts are released, what is the marine survival and the return rate from fish that have been taken from successful anandromous fish that return to the dam? What happens in the second generation? Do they have a better survival than just the eggs from the kokanee? That's why the Alouette study, I think, is really important to help Coquitlam move forward, and really important for Alouette when they do look deeper into what their options are in the future. This would provide them data on how perhaps to best restore their population in the Alouette Lake. So I'll just show you this quick overview map of the watershed, the Coquitlam River watershed. We'll talk later about this concept down at Monday Creek, right at the bottom end of the river down by the Metro Vancouver Colony Farm. But if you look at the far upper end of the watershed, you'll see the Coquitlam River Sockeye Hatchery. And then just a little bit farther is the Coquitlam Dam Trap location at the outlet of Coquitlam Reservoir. They're relatively in close proximity. But again, I'd like to talk about some thoughts about questions related to getting fish into traps. For the hatchery program to work, there has to be a way to capture the adults. Typically, the ideal is they'll enter a trap, or potentially they would enter a holding area that could be, nets could be used to collect broodstock. But some planning could be done to make that a little more practical, where they actually held and people could collect them if they didn't enter traps. So this is just an overview of the proposed Coquitlam River Sockeye hatchery location. And I just want to point out again the challenges of managing this return of adults to the Coquitlam River, adult sockeye, is how do you catch them? Where will they go? How do you catch them? And then how do you hold them successfully so they can spawn? So let's just talk about the catching part. I noticed the hatchery when I pulled it up on Google Earth is adjacent to the junction of two major streams. That's the upper Coquitlam River, showed in blue, and Ore Creek, showed in yellow. Depending on the rain events, Ore Creek is often the dominant flow in the river, and the upper Coquitlam River, being a managed flow, is the smaller flow. Now that may be different in the peak of summer. Again, though, if fish are migrating in July, there may be enough snowmelt up in Ore Creek to keep its flow larger. Now, why does it matter? When you incubate and rear any salmon in a hatchery, they are imprinting on the water supply that they're rearing in. And this is the way they will find their way back home. So the question I would have for the designers, what is the intent? Where will the hatchery discharge go? Will it go to ground, infiltrate back into the ground? Will it go into some sort of sewer system? Or is it just going to go back over the bank in the river? So if it goes over the bank in the river, there is, depending on the flow of the sockeye hatchery and how distinct that water supply is, the smell of rearing fish, for instance, if there's going to be yearling smolts or fry pretty well year round, it's going to have a distinct smell. So any adults moving upstream may in fact imprint and stay in that pool. Just about where I showed with the red arrow, the first pool adjacent to that smell imprint. How long will they stay there? We'll find out. Maybe not that long, or maybe a long time. And I just want to get people thinking about the outflow of Chilliwack hatchery. I think some of the studies showed, 80% of the coho that returned up that way or more came to the hatchery outflow, and 20% went above and went into various tributaries within a few kilometers. So an idea of imprinting. Now, the design could be modified of the outflow to make it less attractive to fish to imprint on, or potentially more attractive to put it discharging in a particularly attractive pool that could be seined on a regular basis somewhere in this junction. I've showed the red arrow going to the very bottom end of the upper Coquitlam River in the first major pool. Maybe that would be something to do, or alternately you try to get all the groundwater to go into a soak, or the hatchery water to go into a soak pit and not enter the surface water, so there's no confusion. There is the intent, I think, the long-term intent is to get the adults to pass by the hatchery location and move upstream to Coquitlam Dam, where there is trapping facilities we can talk about. So here's just a shot of the spawning channel, and that's the salmon trap at its head, where the water flow for the channel comes from at the base of Coquitlam Dam. And ideally, this is the migration path that the returning sockeye would take and enter the adult trap. And the question would be, how could you maximize the chances that hatchery-reared salmon would be imprinted enough to move up this spawning channel and be willing to go into a trap, which is a confined space. And I think that'll be the challenge of the program. So here's just a close-up of the adult trap at the head end of that spawning channel. And the question I have, if you were a sockeye salmon, would you go into that dark hole? And I think that again, how to make that most attractive, whether there could be some tarps placed over the stream, downstream of this trap, But I think everything has to be done to get fish to come back to this site and be willing to go into a fish trap. Because without trapping of returns, and they'll simply hold in the river and spawn in the river and not contribute to the next generation of sockeye salmon in the Coquitlam River watershed. So as I said, let's assume that the fish entered the fish traps and were trapped successfully and transported to the hatchery. It is unknown if any of them will survive to spawn. From our experience on the Alouette, I think it's going to be a challenging part of the program just to get fish to survive from July to spawning in October. But it's done in other sites for other species. So there is hope, but there's no guarantee. So can we have another alternate plan to test to see if it provides a way to get fish to maturity if they were captured quite early in the summer? And what I'm suggesting is a consideration, at least, of using the adjacent pond, the Grant's Tomb Habitat Pond. It has an outlet and then a flowing inlet, and the flowing inlet is fed from the same water supply as the fish trap. And one potential option, a couple options. One, Grant's Tomb Pond may be a good place to release the smolts and not let them migrate for a week or so. Leave them in the pond, let them transition somewhat from a hatchery environment to more natural environment, and also to strongly imprint on that water supply if possible. At that point, they could be have the opportunity to leave the pond through the outlet channel. So again, an idea of imprinting. You can also just release them at the fish trap site, which I think was probably the plan. But the idea that they move very quickly, they might move in a day or two. They're not used to flowing water. They may want to migrate right away. But the idea of holding them here might be best done in the pond where they're somewhat protected from most of their predators while they understand the big world as opposed to the hatchery tubs. Anyway, Grant's Tomb Pond, I think it has an option as an imprinting site for juveniles. Second, of the adults trapped as they return successfully trapped in the adult trap, could they also release a portion of those fish in the pond itself? It could have a fish trap at its entrance and its upper spawning channel. I'll show a little sketch of it. Now the idea being that these fish, let's say they return to the native population going into the reservoir, would be in a still water environment all summers long. So the hatchery is that type of environment, but it's much more confined. If you released a portion of the fish in this pond, would they actually survive the summer? Would the otters target them enough to either harass them so they weren't successful to mature, or would they just not like being in the pond and die? The temperatures maybe weren't optimum, but the pond gives another relatively low stress area to hold adults for long periods of time. So I'll just talk a little bit more about that concept. So here's just an aerial view of the Grant's Tomb Pond and the adult trap. The blue line is the upper Coquitlam River. It comes from the top of the slide from the dam release through the tunnel. Main stem is there, but if you see a little side channel, that's the so-called spawning channel that was constructed when the dam was upgraded. And the very top end in the red square is the adult trap we just saw in the previous slide. Now, Grant's Tomb Pond is shown with a little white star. It's off to the side, but it's fed by that yellow line from the same structure. The salmon trap feeds a little short spawning channel that feeds Grant's Tomb Pond. And then there's a separate outlet shown in green that feeds the water then back into the upper Coquitlam River in a side channel of the Coquitlam River there. So one concept would be to put an adult trap at the entrance of the outlet, the red square by the green line. So any fish coming up would be trapped there, and it wouldn't allow fish to leave the pond. And then secondarily, there'd be a trap in yellow. That's a little spawning channel that feeds the pond. Now that could be a trap, but it would be closed off until you wanted to actually capture fish. So one concept would be you would capture fish that moved up the blue line into the adult trap and put a portion in the pond. to let them mature. Now, if they were a mixed population of perhaps some of these experimental releases that spawned mid-August and September, around mid-August, you can open up the trap and see what you get in that little yellow line. And what I suspect is those fish, as they matured, would be seeking out gravel and would be really motivated to move upstream. So you would start capturing the early run fish that are ready to spawn. And then you could either give them a drive to the upper watershed, or you could give them a drive down to the hatchery, but they've spent perhaps a few weeks in the pond maturing, not having to go to the hatchery, this group. Secondarily, if some of the fish had been mixed in and at the fish track and the main fish trap from the blue line, some were the early run and some were the summer run that want to go to the reservoir, they're not going to mature to October, November. So again, if they were placed in a mixed population with some of these early runs, the early runs would be separated out because they spawn a month and a half, 2 months earlier than the others. And then the only question would be, the fish you put in there from the summer run, would they survive the summer from predation or just inappropriate holding conditions? And when they're mature, would they be driven to go upstream into that trap if you opened it on October 1, for instance, the little yellow square? And that's the experiment, because once they're in the pond, they would be almost impossible to get out unless they themselves chose to swim upstream. Again, I think it's an asset to test how do you hold fish for 1, 2, or even 3 months potentially successfully to get them ripe so you can take them into fish culture. And I think that'll be a major challenge of the program. I just think Grant's Tomb Pond is there. It has these natural features that I think could be part of the experiment how to do that. So just a thought, we observed in the past when we've built new habitats, often groundwater side channels that were somewhat separated from, let's say, major spawning areas. One comes to mind in Mariah Slough. We actually transported a small group of salmon from an adjacent fish trap, maybe a kilometer away, and we placed them in the new habitat. As soon as we did that, we had other fish show up. So they sensed that spawning was occurring, and it gave them an incentive to go into that new habitat. So again, it's all about attracting fish out of the pond when they are maturing into various fish traps, a little creative capture of very mature fish and putting them, for instance, in that yellow spawning channel. Just a few pairs, maybe just enough to get the rest of them coming up for the trap. Little action on the gravel beds is a great incentive. When you're ready to spawn, you have nowhere to spawn. So just an idea that might be worth experimenting with in the future. So this is a conceptual strategy for how do you manage multiple populations coming up to the base of the dam when you're trapping. How would you manage an early run and a summer run? So the concept of an early run would be, this would be an anadromous population brought into the watershed to replace a population that is no longer exists. And in fact, the habitat to support this population in the reservoir itself no longer exists. And the population suggested was the upper Chilliwack River Sockeye Run. So the trap at the dam would operate conceptually June 1st, or it could be operated earlier if there was earlier fish. But at June 15th, that would be seen as the end of the migration of the early run, whether or not it was finished or not. That was the earliest component. Our information so far, the few fish we've received for the reservoir, what I call the summer run, the indigenous populations from the reservoir, the first one showed, as I'm aware, in Tuoi was July 18th. So these fish would be trapped at the dam. Now, where would they go? Well, a portion could go to the upper river. We'll talk about that. A portion would go into the hatchery up to the egg take target. And a portion, as we just discussed, potentially could go into Grant's Tomb Pond. And I just show a second trapping period in Grant's Tomb. They would be, if they were put into Grant's Tomb, then the trap at the entrance channel would be opened on August 15th, and very mature fish would have a chance to move through for about a month. And this would segregate those fish from anything that came later. Now, looking on path 2, the summer runs, these are the fish native to the reservoirs. We know they spawn very late and at depth, but we don't have good data on their migration timing, but we think they're primarily July, August, September, possibly a little later, but that would be the core. So we would treat any fish after July 15th to September 15th as part of this summer run, but we would understand that it would be a mixed population, potentially with the later timing groups from this early run. So where would they go? They would go into hatchery and potentially up to the egg take targets and beyond, and then in the Grant's Tomb pond, any fish that were actually from the early run, even without genetic sampling, would mature 1 or 2 months earlier, and they would be pulled out either as broodstock for the early run program or destroyed if they were needed, or potentially driven up to the upper river for natural spawning. So we would have the ability to segregate the 2 runs once we put them in culture. The same thing if some of them had been put in Grant's Tomb just to see if they got a higher survival to spawning. The trap would operate maybe from October 15th to December 1st, a timing that would be suitable for that run to want to go into the trap, to physically want, they'd be mature, ready to spawn, and they'd be looking to find some gravel. So it's that idea. The traps would be opened up very strategically based on these 2 behaviors. Anyway, it's how you would manage it long term, and it would be a way to have 2 distinct runs going to 2 distinct habitats. And I'll talk a bit more about the early run. Where would they go, in fact, in the reservoir? So just a couple slides of how this early run sockeye population may be sustained over the long term. So the yellow star is the Coquitlam Dam, and presumably the fish would be trapped at the base of the dam in the fish traps as we discussed. Now if we release them in the reservoir, and that may occur in the future because they would be potentially, some of them would be mixed in with what we would call the summer runs, the ones that will spawn in the reservoir. My guess is they'll likely show up in this larger tributary in the area of red. Some may be able to enter, depending on the flow rates in the particular summer and whether it's a drought year. Enter that stream and spawn. If they spawn in the lower end of the stream, they probably won't be viable once the reservoir refills. But if they move higher in the stream, they may be viable. So summer runs, the early summer runs of this introduced population do have somewhere in the lake to spawn. I think it's very restricted and would not be a large area usable, and probably would need hatchery support to remain viable in the future. However, the second option is looking farther at the reservoir is the upper Coquitlam River, which is somewhat similar in size and nature to the upper Chilliwack River where this population comes from. Unfortunately, the blue line is an anadromous salmon barrier very close to the reservoir, so they couldn't naturally migrate past there. But given the road network, there's a section of stream, particularly a good section of stream with some deep holding pools. And why that's important, that if these fish were transferred to the upper river, they wouldn't be maturing in the lake. They would have to have sizable pools to be able to safely mature for a number of weeks before they were ready to spawn. And this section has particularly good gravel deposit for spawning, and it's within 5 kilometers of the reservoir, which is a reasonable length to migrate for a sockeye fry. On the right-hand side, my recollection, I haven't been on this site since the very beginning of this, not quite 20 years ago, when we were looking at the opportunities to reestablish an anadromous sockeye in Coquitlam Reservoir, and that is before we saw the return of kokanee-derived adults. So before that, we were looking at how would we make an introduced stock viable, and the little red arrow shows a road, and I believe that is an access road in the area of interest, the green circle, that is a flow gauge. So I'll show you a closer look at that site. So this is a picture of what I think is the access road down to the water survey of possibly Canada, but I suspect the water survey of BC Hydro, possibly Metro Vancouver, to gauge the water flow into the reservoir. The two little white dots I've showed with yellow arrows, I think, is a cable that goes over the river. The area in red looks to me like a turnaround potentially, and why it's so important if we are transporting adults, if they're transported in existing fish trailers, you need a pretty good turnaround to get those large pickup trucks and trailers at the end of a road. So that's a sort of a practical thing. Also, you need access to the riverbank to release the fish, and it looks like the access goes pretty close to the edge of the river. And again, this is in a prime holding pool. You'll notice there's a pool that runs for, looks like more than 100 meters upstream, or sort of centered in this area, so a perfect area to release the fish, and there's good gravel deposits upstream and particularly downstream for spawning. So again, it looks like the infrastructure might be there with some minor modifications. The water survey gauge and the delivery team, if they're interested in this concept, should discuss with the land managers and come visit this site. So this is just a little Google Earth estimate how long a distance for travel time hauling adult fish to that upper release site that I just showed in the previous slide. It says it's about 17 kilometers, and obviously we've missed a few of the curves, so roughly 20 kilometers there, so it's a 40-kilometer round trip. In the future, the question is how many adults would the interest be willing to move into the upper end, this upper end. I know in the Coquitlam River, there's probably a transport about the same length. I think they go from 2,000 to 7,000 adults. Again, it comes down to how much effort the team wants to put in to this initiative. And the more fish up there, obviously they'll occupy a portion of the lake's rearing capacity. And ideally that would be done if it turned out that they were the dominant anadromous form returning to the dam. So again, the idea of parallel paths, this might be a path to get anadromous fish consistently returning to the Coquitlam Dam over a relatively short period. You'll know if it works or it doesn't. The work of re-anadromizing kokanee has not been done in any meaningful way that I'm aware of. So it is a long-term goal, and it may take many generations to see a significant population of return. So this again covers these parallel paths, hopefully success of all these paths, but they'll be on perhaps different timelines. No, so that brings another point, because and I can bring it up because I'm not in the business, it's for the people at the table. The returning of Sockeye to the Coquitlam River is very much about a cultural experience and a cultural relationship with the Coquitlam First Nation. And their connection often was the harvest of fish for food for their community. It's too early to talk about that per se, because we don't know if we can have a significant return. But if we do get a significant return, I suspect it'll come from this early run component. It's a run that's completely maintained by the action of humans in terms of transporting to an area that they could not naturally get to. But again, there is nothing natural about a reservoir with a large dam and a managed elevation and flows, as we've discussed. So this program could continue as long as the dam exists. And in my understanding, since it's 30% of Metro Vancouver's water supply, whether or not we use the power in the future, water is really hard to replace. So I suspect this is a long-term program. So if we were successful in getting thousands of fish back, do we transport thousands of fish? One things that came to mind, would you, if it was a lot of hauling involved, would you transport, female ratio 2:1 to male, just to try to get the efficiency of moving fish up to the spawning grounds, those sorts of things. So again, like many hatcheries that I was involved with in years past. Fish come up the hatchery outlet. I'm thinking of Chilliwack Hatchery. Those deemed surplus to production needs are then taken off as a contract for surplus fish to an entity. And in the past, First Nations have bid or partnerships have been made with First Nations to take over that role. So in the Coquitlam River, it's my sense that if there is a harvestable surplus in the future, people should look at this early run as a good place to do it, and it would fit, I presume, within existing practice in other man-operated facilities here in the Lower Mainland. So I'd like to switch gears into the third path, the third parallel path I'm suggesting for reestablishing a sockeye population in the Coquitlam River watershed. And that's looking at these ocean-type rearing sockeye, and it would focus at the lower portion of the watershed that would be more appropriate habitat for these types of sockeye salmon. So let's talk a little bit more about the Monday Creek experimental sockeye release. So looking down a little closer at the area of Monday Creek itself, it's probably not a particularly well-known creek for many from not the area. If you look at the off to the right, there's a number of areas of interest. The area circled in yellow is called the Sheep Paddocks Tidal Off-Channel Wetland Habitat. It was a restored habitat from in early 2000s. The little green arrow is the path of Monday Creek. You can see it starts up in the hillside. It's quite a reasonably high elevation hill for this area. And Monday Lake at the top comes through a forested ravine and then breaks down onto the Fraser floodplain. The area of interest is the area circled in red. There's another restored, constructed wetland habitat adjacent to Monday Creek. And then it passes under the large low-heat highway corridor. And then it goes between the railway tracks and the highway as a roadside ditch, primarily a reed canary grass type channel. And then it again enters under the railway track and then goes into the Coquitlam River. I've noted the little blue box is an indication where this proposed trap site would be located. So let's talk about some of these areas I've highlighted. The first one we'll talk about is the Sheep Paddocks area highlighted in yellow. So this was a suggested area of release for the hatchery-reared Harrison River sockeye fry. Their ecology is not fully known, but effectively they live in these wetland habitats all along the Fraser corridor as they move from their spawning grounds in the Harrison River. And they enter the ocean through over a number of months, presumably from May, June, July, and August. So they have various lengths of rearing. We do know they rear in these wetland type habitats. So the idea of releasing some of the hatchery fry anyway in the wetland is they could be released and perhaps even held by a simple juvenile seine net just to hold them so they imprint well on this wetland. And that's related to getting them to come back as adults so they could be trapped. It's a relatively large wetland, very productive. When we get into release strategy, we know that coho smolts winter in this wetland, but they're largely gone by May 15th, somewhere between May 15th and June 1st. They're effectively all left. So it would be likely the best time to release these juvenile sockeye might be just at the very end of this coho smolt migration, so there's no interactions. And but also that's the time of year where the temperatures are rising. So that's part of the experimental nature of this area. If it was too warm, it might be shifted more into Monday Creek itself, which flows at a much cooler temperature, likely at that time of year. So we'll just look at the sheep paddock just a little bit more. So this is just a picture of a piece of the sheep paddock tidal wetland. It goes up and down at roughly ½ a meter of tide. So there's water movement. Very rich rearing area. Would be ideal, from what I've read about the ecology of Harrison River sockeye fry, to spend days, a week or two in this wetland as they sort of transition from a hatchery environment to the natural world, but also it would increase the chances they would imprint. This water effectively comes from Monday Creek on the tide. So again, this is the sheep paddocks, one of the proposed release sites. So again, if the water temperature in sheep paddocks, if it was a warm spring, the thought was to move them farther up Monday Creek into perhaps cooler water. A good site, I think, to release is where the stream comes out of the gully. It's quite cool. There's a constructed wetland that may or may not be a good site to release, but the creek itself would be a good site to release because downstream of this point is a long straight section that's effectively a roadside ditch. Lots of reed canary grass, which actually for a small fry is really good cover and lots of food. Productivity, open to the sun, but still relatively cool. If you notice, I've shown in yellow, it looks like there's an access road either to City Coquitlam, possibly BC Hydro to access their power lines, but that gives a site to get in and release fry. This is the upper site on Monday Creek. So this is just a picture of that roadside channel of Monday Creek after it's come out of its gully, come onto the highway, and now is moving down toward the sheep paddocks area. It's just a roadside ditch, but again, a very rich environment for the early part of the spring, and we have a good water quality supply from Monday Creek. So I think this would be really high value habitat for a small sockeye fry from the Harrison River population. And if they liked it, they could linger as long as they wanted, and that would just increase the chances as an adult they would imprint on this habitat, potentially come back so they could be trapped and assessed. So the last place I thought I'd talk about on this Monday Creek is where Monday Creek passes under a flood dike directly into the Coquitlam River. There's about a 15-meter section of Monday Creek on the other side of this culvert. So perhaps a gravel pad could be placed and a temporary fall trap put in this site. It's got good road access above it there. You can see it's Metro Vancouver Parks. And for a study site, this would be an excellent place to capture sockeye salmon. Monday Creek actually gets a reasonable flow in the fall once the fall rains come, so that would act as an attractant flow for fish coming up from the Coquitlam River. Again, an interesting site to do an assessment of adult returns from this experimental release of Harrison River sockeye fry into Monday Creek. So I just wanted to point out on that spreadsheet, this is a conceptual on how you would actually manage having three populations, distinct populations in the watershed at the same time. How would you separate them? In the early years, certain releases could be marked, but in the future, if there was natural spawning, you'd have these three distinct runs, what I call the early run, the summer run, and the fall run. If you notice up at the dam, the early run would be only trapped and placed in various places, some upstream in the upper river, some in the hatchery, potentially some in Grant's Tomb Pond to mature, but only from June 1st to June 15th. Could there be other populations included, like the very first arrivals from the summer run? Yes, but they should be relatively rare. Now, after July 15th, as I recall, the first sockeye we captured was July 18th. It is likely going to be a mixed population of what was the new early run and the summer run. So again, how would you manage that population? 50% would go to the hatchery and 50% perhaps go to Grant's Tomb Pond if that was a viable option. This is just a conceptual. They could all go to the hatchery. Now, at the hatchery, the early run would mature typically by September 1, maybe as late as September 15th, no later. And those would self-identify themselves in the hatchery. The fish that were the true summer run, the indigenous population from Coquitlam Lake, would mature much later. So that's a way to self-segregate in the hatchery if you're holding them in a mixed group. And that was the idea of Grant's Tomb. Could you put them in Grant's Tomb together, and the earliest ones would enter a trap again at the headwater stream of Grant's Tomb as they matured and became somewhat desperate to find spawning gravel. And hopefully that would be a way to segregate out the early run from the summer run. Now the summer run in Grant's Tomb pond may be an issue. They're lake spawners. Maybe they won't have the behavior to move upstream looking for gravel, but that's what the nature of this experiment is, just to see how the various behaviors work. Now, falling down to the fall run, as we've talked about it, it's a stream that we're attempting to have it home back to is Monday Creek by releasing it in these various wetlands and channels. But if they're going to come from the Harrison River, this is a big leap from a very large river to a very small river. We don't know the behavior at return. I will say, observing how the Harrison River Chinook have fared over the years when they were transplanted into relatively small creeks like the Nickelmackle, they in fact moved upstream to through very small streams to find spawning gravel. So the desire to spawn in gravel was stronger than the sort of the inherent nature of the Harrison Chinook to stay in the large water body that is the Harrison River. Now, maybe these Harrison River sockeye will do the same. They'll key into Monday Creek and come into the fish trap. Now, if they don't, there's a large amount of gravel between Monday Creek and the hatchery. The other logical place that they may be keying into is the hatchery, the water supply, but I suspect it's the Coquitlam River water supply. And if they found gravel just upstream from Monday Creek and they were quite mature, it's likely they would start spawning very close to Monday Creek and slowly work their way upstream. Now, where do they become a problem? Only if they entered the dam trap. And now they become part of that mixed population. But you notice the dam ceases operation on September 15th at the end of the summer run. There may be later fish, but those would be excluded. And the fall run would yet to presumably penetrate that far in the watershed. We believe they spawn quite a bit later, and the hope is they would not enter the trap any earlier than September 15th. And again, that's part of the experiment to do the genetic test to see where these various runs end up and what their timing is entering the key places, basically where they enter the traps are the key places to make this managed population with various timings and behaviors workable over the long term. So I think that wraps up our journey. I've laid out three parallel paths, hopefully to the same destination. That's a successful sockeye run reestablishment in the Coquitlam River. I know we were very excited when this verse came up as a possibility. I think probably as early as 204, and then releases in 205 on the Alouette and adults returning in 207. So it has been a long journey, and a lot of good studies have been done, a lot of questions have been answered, but in reality, at some point you have to do real experiments with real fish, because they're going to do what they're going to do no matter how many of these studies we put together trying to guesstimate what they will do in nature. So this lays out a path that I think can be done, I think, practically. And at the very least, it'll generate some good discussion and hopefully no buns flying through the airs, and strengthen teamwork. And hopefully within the decade, we'll start to see some positive signs whether things proposed here might work or should work or could work. Anyway, good luck.